Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and we're back in the garage again. It's kind of been a while since my last update, just a lot and a little all kind of going on at the same time. A lot of it just kind of hurry up and wait, unfortunately. Well, on many fronts actually. So let me start off with where we were on the Zero. So the engine needed to be rebuilt and we needed to toss that back in the car. Well, that's kind of what's happening in this video. I'm gonna roll a quick little time lapse as I'm talking through it. But basically, the engine needed a rod. Of the 4 rods in the motor, only one of them suffered any kind of heat damage from a spun bearing. I had shut the motor down. We discovered all this last time when we tore the motor apart. I had reached out to a couple of vendors to get a new rod, a replacement rod, either a set or a single. I want to give a quick shout out to the guys over at Fab9 Tuning. Now, the initial build for the motor, I sourced a lot of parts from them. Just the basics like bearings, etc., but they also supplied the K1 rods, they supplied the cams, a lot of the top end parts. They were fantastic to work with, so I went with them again. Unfortunately, the K1 rods had been discontinued, and when trying to go with a second set of rods or something that might work, the rods that got shipped to me turned out to be just the wrong ones. They were for the 2.5 motor instead of the 2-liter, and there was just no way I could use them. So again, working with them, they got me a label, got everything returned. Even though that part of the deal didn't really work out, they were still amazing to work with. So even though this wasn't, a perfect experience, they were still really good in correcting the mistakes that were made, and I cannot recommend them enough. So I did reach out, however, to K1 rods themselves, and luckily enough, they had just one rod sitting on the shelf, and they were able to ship that out. So I was able to get that in, get everything balanced, and then get the motor reassembled and back in the car. Getting the motor back in the car, though, was a bit of a hassle. Getting the motor out was super easy, nothing doing. In fact, it was far simpler than I remembered. It came out actually very, very quick. Putting it back in was a huge pain. For the life of me, I just could not get the engine and the transmission to line up correctly. And some of that had to do with just that the engine is canted over 10 degrees, and some of that had to do with just the weird kind of funky angle that you have to drop the motor into the car and then support the transmission on a jack, etc., etc. And so it just was giving me a hard time. So today we've got, well, everything back together. I've already done a couple of test drives, the results of which I'll go over with you in a moment, but I did want to cover a couple of changes that I'd made that are going to be hard to spot, unfortunately. So one, I had pointed out previously the new oil pan, and unfortunately the new oil pan isn't the correct one. It's not the one meant for a motor that's canted over 10 degrees. The difference is sort of like a Ford Focus versus a Miata install. Same engine, just in the Miata it's canted over 10 degrees, whereas in a Focus it's basically straight up and down. It still works in this application, however, it's just suboptimal. You have to put a little more oil into it, but the downside there is that the oil sits above the windage tray if you put too much in, and then it begins kicking it out. Well, the intake and the exhaust, just whipping up the oil. So it's something you got to be careful with. The other issue, we can't really see, but tucked down in this dark hole is on the side of the oil pan where the dipstick is. It comes out right in the way of our engine mount, where the engine mount sits down in here. and the dipstick hole for the oil pan just basically opens up right into the side of it. So I had to just plug the dipstick hole and figure out a separate solution. And that solution is actually our valve cover. So on the Ford motors, well, I should say on the Ford 2.0 liter engines, there was no dipstick in the valve cover. Instead, they had run it all the way down to the pan, and it would come up like through the intake manifold. On Mazdas and later Ford engines that had timing control, so cam timing, there's a solenoid that sits right here. And then those motors did have a dipstick hole. And in fact, if we look over here on the bench, I have one. So this is the hole where the solenoid would go that I don't have. And this is the hole where the dipstick goes through, and it just slides down the inside of the block down through the head and into the oil pan. There's a couple other provisions that are different with this valve cover. Like there's no hole cut for our water temperature sensor, which is here in the middle on the Ford engine. You can see there's one here, but we're not actually using it. And likewise, there's two provisions for heated nut certs to go into the valve cover for different cam timing sensors. This is mostly the difference between early and late cars. For cars that had a single timing tooth on the cam, and those that had like, I think it was like 5 or 6 to set the cam phase timing for motors that had an adjustable intake and exhaust cam. Whereas this particular model would be just the intake side only. So that's a change that we're going to have to make just to add a dipstick back into the car. Shouldn't be too much of an issue. I just need to fab up a plug where the solenoid goes into the valve cover. Another change I made was replacing this oil filter adapter and sandwich plate oil cooler adapter setup mess because it was leaking. Inevitably, when you have a sandwich plate like this, I've just never had them seal 100%. And I never did actually find where this was leaking from. If it was leaking between this surface and the block, if it was this O-ring in between here, if it was leaking from where this nut goes through. I don't believe it was the fittings. Regardless, it did always have a drip from this area on the back of the block. And where that sits is down here right below the starter. Again, just absolutely killer views, but it's under the starter under here. So instead, what I have done is I replaced that piece with a Mountoon piece that keeps our sensors. So this would be for our oil pressure sensor, and then our oil pressure sort of idiot light sensor, which apparently I ignore. And those go into the housing, and built into the Mountoon piece is there's 2 AN10 fittings that'll take our oil lines that go up to the front of the car, which was another side project that I had to do. See if our flashlight technology works. Sort of looking around our steering shaft, you can see those AN10 lines that wrap down in there. And those are our oil lines, and they go all the way up into the front. Those go to our filter mount down there, which you can see, and then to the oil cooler way tucked up in the nose. And with all of that done, had the motor running, went for a test drive, went for actually a few test drives just to feel everything out, make sure it was all okay. One of the things that I found disassembling the motor was that the timing tools that I have advance the crank about 1 degree to 2 degrees. It's a very small amount, but it's just enough. And so when I reassembled the motor, I corrected that double checked my measurements, took everything apart, and then did it again just to double check and make sure. And now the timing is absolutely correct, and it does have a little more pep for sure. But that also means that the car needs to go in for another dyno session, both because we changed the exhaust, but now that the timing is actually correct, I'm sure we can get a little more power out of it than we had previously. One more item that we did while we had the car apart, I was just tired of this bare aluminum center armrest. Glare wasn't really an issue, it was just very plain looking. And I had this kind of sticker bomb wrap just floating around. So I hit most of the panels with this sticker bomb wrap, and I really love the way that it came out. It just, I don't know, it makes it just look better visually to my eye. And I just ran out of material before I could do the switch plate, and that is next. Hi, Kumo. Hi, yeah, I see your tail wagging. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's where we're at. Just a few little things here and there. Got to put a few more miles on it, make sure everything is up to snuff again. And oh, there is one more thing. So while I had it out on a test drive, we ran into, well, I should say I ran into a major issue, and luckily I was able to get the car home. But I've mentioned previously about nut and bolting whatever car you're working on, whether it be a kit car, whether it be just redoing the suspension on a daily or a track car or whatever. Just regular inspections are something you should do. And the reason is here on the Zero, down here on the caliper, there is a bridge bolt that goes through the caliper, and what that does is it reinforces the caliper and it helps retain the brake pads in the caliper. Sort of does double duty there. Well, on the Zero, the M6 lock nut that's on the back side loosened on both sides of the car and came out. And the only thing keeping this bolt in the car was it tapping the backside of the spokes every now and again, and it left just the smallest little marks, but the bolt did not fall out and it didn't break off when getting caught in the spokes or anything like that. And that was just a lucky find. I was able to slap a zip tie in there and actually get the car home, but that was almost a really bad day. And so when I got the car home, not only did I find that that bolt was loose, but my bottom spindle mount or hub mount bolt was loose. And it's a hub mount, like these bolts here, these M10s, weren't exactly loose, but they weren't torqued to spec either. And so they still had some torque to them, but they definitely weren't torqued to spec. So I went through all of the front, retorqued everything, and I'm going to be driving the Zero next week, just commuting it back and forth to work, just to make sure that we got everything and everything's up to snuff. So, bit of a moment, but glad I found it before anything bad happened. A lot going on, not a lot on video, but a bit of an update nonetheless. So the hurry up and wait is really for parts for the Zero, got those in, and then just things not working out like I wanted them to. Something else that's been kind of burning some time is poor Kumo finally got snipped. He's about 4 years old, and it's a little late, but it's about time. And so that poor guy has just been all drugged up all week, and we've been taking good care of him. So that has also taken some time away from the garage. Now that he's healing up, I can spend a little more time out here. Got some projects to do on the Ultima, actually, some more maintenance there. And we'll get it back in. And actually the Civic needs a little love, so that might make an appearance in the garage. So that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.